Great Supernatural Stories by Stefan Dziemianowics. Introduction. In the concluding paragraphs of his landmark essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, first published in its entirety in 1939, horror master H.P. Lovecraft offered the following observation regarding the tale of supernatural horror. At the time, Lovecraft wrote these words: supernatural horror fiction was establishing itself as a popular fiction genre in the pulp fiction magazines that flourished in the first half of the 20th century. The authors whom he mentions by name, Arthur Machen and Ambrose Bierce, both of whom are represented in Great Supernatural Stories, along with Lovecraft himself, wrote in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at a time when the idea of supernatural fiction as a fiction genre was only beginning to gain traction. Consequently, these authors' tales of supernatural were looked on in their days as no different from their non-supernatural stories. Lovecraft, who died in 1937, clearly anticipated the burgeoning popularity of the tale of the supernatural. But he surely could not have imagined that by the end of the 20th century, supernatural horror fiction would be a robust and thriving literary genre, and that several of its best writers would be charting regularly on the bestseller list with books that appealed to readers beyond the genre's traditional niche audience. Great Supernatural Story represents a selection of tales published in the watershed period just prior to the tide of tales that Lovecraft saw flood and eventually alter the topography of the popular fiction landscape. It could span nearly a century and includes the work of well-known literary writers: Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson, Rudyard Kipling, Robert S. Hitchens, and H.G. Wells, to name but a few, and writers such as Lovecraft himself, from whom the tale of the supernatural was a specialty. This volume also includes stories by relatively unknown writers whose contribution represents one of a handful of stories that they published in their lifetime. The selections for Great Supernatural Story features all of the most common figures in the fandom of supernatural beings: ghosts, vampires, witches, shapeshifters, and zombies. By definition, though, the supernatural has a much broader scope that these entities alone embody, and that this is virtually limitless in its expression. This is evident in the book's oldest story, Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, whose palace setting is haunted by a phantom, not a ghost, but a being who incarnates an inescapable pestilence ravaging the surrounding countryside. William Hope Hoggin's Demons of the Sea, written nearly 3/4 of a century later, takes the tale of the supernatural in a direction opposite to that of Poe's story. Does its sea spawn monster represent a natural species hitherto overlooked by science, or an expression of the stimulation of wonder and fancy by such enlarged vistas and broken barriers as modern science has given us? It's safe to say that all of the stories in this volume fall somewhere between the extremes of the familiar and the previously unimagined possibilities in supernatural literature. You, the reader, may feel the sum of the selection range even farther afield. To that extent, Great Supernatural Stories feature some of the most imaginatively conceived representations of the tale of supernatural horror. These stories have helped to shape a literary tradition that still exerts its influence today. Stefan Dziemianowics, New York, 2017. The selections for Great Supernatural Story feature